Okay, welcome back. This is part two of my lecture on the three art media of watercolor, oil painting, and acrylic. When we were last talking, we were talking about Titian and kind of like this important moment where Titian really starts to emphasize that painting can be very loose and expressive, and that the mark making does not have to be carefully hidden within a painting, but it can become really part of the art. There's one thing I did want to go back to just very quickly, because on this page I never mentioned anything about this Matisse, this beautiful, hopefully well-known Matisse piece, and it is made with gouache, but it is cut paper. Just the point here is that, like, what he would do is he would hand color his own papers with gouache, and then he would cut and design these kind of type designs, very similar to the sort of things he made for his very famous book Jazz. um, anyway, getting back. So that same kind of approach to oil painting um, is a kind of a live tradition. And if we had all the time in the world, I could go through a number of artists from the Baroque, through Velasquez. We could go all the way through the Rococo into the French Romantic period. We could look at Delacroix and this ongoing, continuing tradition of sort of painterly painting, right? And painters, right? Painters who paint for the joy of the mark making and of the layering and of the finding of imagery through that process. Um, but I'm just really going to pick two artists. Tiepolo would also be another one I'd put in that list. I'm just going to instead focus on two artists kind of at either end of that spectrum of that long tradition. And so Titian at the start and DeKooning much further into the 20th century. Um, and I want you to think of DeKooning as being, as much as you might look at this painting and see it as being a completely radical approach to painting, I see it as really just a natural extension of that same tradition. It is painting where it's about the fact that paint should be about the mark making of paint, right? It's what you do with your hand and your brush and your paint and how you put those things down. That is, one possible definition of what makes a painting. Um, and so here are some other examples by one by Richard Diebenkorn, another by Hans Hofmann. Very different painters in some ways, but both really kind of following that idea. And a lot of the American abstract expressionist movement could be seen as essentially just a modern version of that very traditional idea of painting being about the act of the painter putting marks down on the canvas. We could, much of what we find beautiful about Vincent Van Gogh is that same quality, right? It's not just the design, although the design is gorgeous. It's not just the color decisions, although his color decisions are extraordinary, like just amazing. But it's also his hand and how willing he is to allow us to see his hand, to make his hand be the rhythm and the language of his mark making system, be the primary joy of the painting. Here's another example. We've seen this painting before when I talked about it in terms of uh, paintings that use split complementary color organizations. But this is a Joan Mitchell painting, and it's also very much a painting about the mark making. And notice her mark making system is very different, probably more similar to someone like who are we looking at, that like Cy Twombly, um, but also on his own. Now, and when in these lectures on different media, I've tried my very best to include some artists that I've actually known. And I've known so many painters because I studied painting. So it was really hard for me to narrow down, but I picked the two most famous people that I studied with, James McGarrell and Bob Barnes. And then I also picked one contemporary of mine, a close friend of mine who works at Mississippi State and is a very good friend of mine. So I studied an undergraduate with James McGarrell, although I only took one class with him, but he was an ongoing influence in the department all the time. I still remember to the day to this day, the time I was able to visit his studio and he gave us a talk in his studio. It was really amazing. He's truly an extraordinary painter. And Robert Barnes, who when I went to graduate school, I studied under Robert Barnes, along with a number of other really important people, most notably William Itter, who was extremely influential on me. Um, and But yes, these are two painters who had a strong impact on my career. And then lastly, I wanted to talk about Jeffrey Haupt. Jeffrey Haupt, who is a good friend of mine, he lives just down the road in my neighborhood. His kids and my kids are good friends, and he teaches at Mississippi State. And obviously, I teach at the W. I actually knew him because when he started at State, it was the same year I started at State. And Jeffrey Haupt also went to Indiana University for graduate school, although we did not overlap in time. And I just admire his painting so much, both the figurative painting like this Miss A piece that over here on the left, which was the work he was doing, similar kind of work when he first started at Mississippi State, and his current work, which is more kind of sort of loosely based off of maybe some people like Bryce Martin, but it's definitely his own thing. It's just amazing color decisions, and I am always indebted to every conversation I have with Jeffrey Haupt. Okay, I think we have enough time that we can wrap this up, I'm pretty sure. So I just had a couple other kind of 20th century examples of painterly painting. We've seen this Richard Diebenkorn here before. I talked about it a little bit when we were talking about the use of negative space shapes. And I'm including it here in part because I want you to realize that really loose expressive painting in the 20th century doesn't have to mean completely, giving up on all imagery or all imagery being really hard to read. It can be something like, a lemon and a pair of scissors. I do have a little bit of time, so I'm going to just talk a little bit more about Philip Guston for a second. Philip Guston is, and you've probably seen, yeah, I think you've seen his paintings a couple of times. I talked about him when we talked about the narrative impulse, where I talked about how even when you're trying to not have narrative in a painting or not have representation in a painting, it still sometimes happens. But one of the reasons why I keep putting Philip Guston paintings into these lectures is because I love Philip Guston's paintings. I'm a huge fan, and I love all of the different stages of his painting. And if we have time at the end of class, I might do a little mini lecture just on that. Okay, so this lecture is going to end on acrylic, and so I think this is actually the last slide. Oh no, wait, I do have some more contemporary artists to talk about. So acrylic painting, and I did just pick these two as examples. I really love this Mark Rothko acrylic painting on paper, and I think for me it typifies the potential in acrylic. Like generally when we think of acrylic, we think, oh, it's really good at creating these flat and very kind of pristine and hard edge type decisions in paintings, but it can be also a much more nuanced, a much more layered type painting medium. And I think Rothko's work with it demonstrates that. So lastly, I just have a set of, where did they go? A set of contemporary artists with images. For some reason, the Katerina Gross is not showing up with the images. So we're just going to look at Pia Friese and Angela de la Cruz, who's a British artist. And these are very contemporary examples of painting, very contemporary takes on painting. So, all right, I'm going to end right there because we don't have any images from Katerina Gross. I think the files were probably too large or something. All right, I will see you next lecture.